Everybody's joining now. So thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm just going to give it a minute or two for the attendees to get online and for the live stream to go onto Facebook. Okay, so thank you for coming along to this meeting tonight, which is Women's Voices for Julian Assange. We're joined tonight by Alia, who is a psychotherapist, Suzie Gilbert, a filmmaker and producer, Lucy Nichols, who's going to be representing the Stop the War Student and Youth, and Lindsey German, the convener of Stop the War. So in 2001, Stop the War was founded to oppose the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. These wars went ahead, pushed by neoliberal leaders from either side of the Atlantic, and were bloodier and more corrupt than we ever could have imagined. When WikiLeaks released the war logs and we were faced with the reality of the atrocities committed by the governments that represent us, many of us felt intense shame, disgust and sadness. And the injustices were the war crimes, such as the notorious killing of the Reuters journalists by the American Apache helicopter. More than 15,000 civilians died in previously unknown incidents. The US and the UK officials insisted that there was no record of the civilian casualties, but the logs of 66,081 non-combatant deaths out of a total of 109 fatalities. Numerous reports of detainee abuse, often supported by medical evidence. They described prisoners shackled, blindfolded and hung by their wrists or ankles. And they were subjected to whipping, punching, kicking and electric shocks. And 6 reports ended with detainees' apparent death. But that's not how America's seen it. They want to scrabble around in the litter tray, covering their dirt. And the only way to do that is to discredit the source and deter future such acts. The crux of the Assange case for extradition to the US, which will be heard surprisingly by a magistrate next month in the UK, that there are no crux to the case. It's not even clear what crime he's being detained for, and the farce surrounding the case grows more and more troubling. As a publisher, when the logs were released, Assange's role was no different than that of any other publication who made the logs public. If Assange is to be charged, then surely those behind the New York Times should face the same fate. But this is a witch hunt, not justice. Assange showed that one man could change the course of history. Through WikiLeaks, he started a revolution of truth which destroyed the illusion of power. We've been sent so many diversions away from the grim reality that I started this meeting with, of what happened to the civilians in the Middle East and the disproportionate effect that these wars had on women. We stand with those women today, and we stand as women who oppose the cynical abuse of our fury over male violence being used by the state to unjustly punish a whistleblowing operation which exposed more than we could have ever imagined. So I'd like to bring in our speakers now, and we've got, we have the honour of being joined by Lindsey German. Thank you, Lindsey.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Helen, and it's good to be on a panel which is all women. It's not very usual, but it's very welcome. And this is obviously an incredibly important case that we're dealing with. I mean, Helen's outlined some of the issues with it, but just to say that I cannot think of a case of civil liberties for many, many years in this country which has been such a denial of civil liberties on such a serious level as this one of Julian Assange. I mean, I suppose if you go back to some of the trials of the Irish, which were all turned out to be miscarriages of justice in the 70s and 80s, you could perhaps see similarities. But you've got a situation here, and I mean, I don't know how much people watching will know about this, but the court process already is a complete fiasco, where half the time he's detained in Belmarsh prison obviously all the time. Half the time, last time he was supposed to be coming into court, they said they couldn't find him, and this is a high security prison. How come you can't find one of your prisoners to bring them to the court case? He's denied very often access to his solicitors, who obviously rely on being able to talk to him about all sorts of different cases, different aspects of the case at different times. And he has been in solitary confinement. He isn't now in solitary confinement, but he has been for a very long time. I'm sure Alia will be talking about some of the implications of that for anybody. But before that, obviously, he was in the Ecuadorian embassy claiming asylum for a number of years and was forcibly evicted from that embassy. So I think we've got a very serious breach of civil liberties here before we even talk about the actual case that the Americans have against him. It seems to me the British are determined to go along with the Americans. Well, there's a surprise to any of us who've seen the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and all these different things, but who are determined to go along with it. And of course, it raises much wider questions. Again, I don't know if people are aware, but traditionally under British law, you were not allowed to extradite anybody for a political offence. That if somebody was a political refugee or seeking to stay in a particular country, you weren't allowed to send them to any other country. This is just, I mean, this is obviously a political case, and it's obviously being, that whole kind of tradition under British law is being completely overruled. I would also say, I think the media coverage of this case is absolutely disgraceful, and particularly from The Guardian, which benefited so much from the WikiLeaks reports earlier on, and which now has really doesn't report it very, very seriously, and nor does the BBC, nor do any of these people. So we're reliant on people finding these things out from meetings like this, and from usually different forms of alternative media. So that's a big issue for us. Now, the crime, as we know, the alleged crime, is that WikiLeaks released into the public domain all sorts of classified documents. These were about the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, where we still have people imprisoned without trial after all these years, after what, 17 years that Guantanamo Bay has been in existence, and about US foreign policy. The story that the US puts is that this put people's lives in danger. There is absolutely no evidence for this whatsoever. What there is a great deal of evidence for is that the interventions themselves and the subsequent occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq in particular, those put many, many people's lives in danger, and many, many people were killed as a result of those military adventures. The most famous WikiLeaks leak is the one, of course, of the people being killed in Iraq, and the absolutely calculating and cruel way that the American soldiers do this. But you know, what we know is this isn't just history. This is something which is still going on. There are still cases where British and American troops are found to have killed unlawfully civilians in Afghanistan in particular, but in Iraq as well, although these really aren't investigated very much anymore. So these are still major issues. What WikiLeaks tried to do was to say that what these people are doing are war crimes, and I think there is absolutely no doubt about it. And it's a compounded crime that actually we don't have honest accounting about what happened in these wars and what is still happening in these wars. You know, you see these migrants coming across the channel who are scapegoated by the media day after day, as we've seen in recent weeks. These are people from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Syria, from Libya, from all the countries where we've intervened. Nobody makes this connection apart from a small number of people like ourselves. You won't read about this. You won't hear about it on the BBC. You won't. This connection isn't made, and it's so important that we have to continue to account for these wars. And we have to say what these wars were about, what the consequences were for people, and what we are still facing as a result of these wars. So all of those, I think, are major questions for us. Just the WikiLeaks, what actually, the idea that Julian Assange, who published WikiLeaks, should be the person who is liable to a possible 175 years in prison, beggars belief in itself. I mean, it's not only a breach of any right to the freedom of the press or to journalistic freedom or any of these things, but it's quite an incredible sleight of hand legally, because it extends liability not just from the person who did the leaks, or the people who did the leaks in particular cases, but to the person who publishes the leaks. But of course, even that isn't quite as it appears, because The Guardian, El País in Spain, all these other papers, none of them are in court, none of them are awaiting extradition, none of them are doing any of these sorts of things. So it's a very selective approach, and of course it's an approach to people who have performed a very, very useful function as whistleblowers and who have told the truth about these wars, in however, only a partial truth. There are so many things that none of us have seen and that none of us know about at the moment, but even that is too much for the authorities in the United States, and let's be clear, in Britain as well. There isn't a cigarette paper between Britain and the United States on any of these questions, on the closure of Guantanamo, on the continuing imperialist interventions in the Middle East and in South Asia. These are all completely in agreement. So this is a big question for us as well. So this is obviously a political case, and it has to be dealt with as a political case. And of course, there are very, very important legal arguments, and Julian Assange, I think, has a very, very good team of lawyers who no doubt will make those political arguments when he is next in court, which is on the 7th of September, and when we are supporting a demonstration called by the Don't Extradite Assange campaign outside the Old Bailey, and it will be in the Old Bailey this time, although they wanted originally to have it in Belmarsh, which is much harder, obviously, to mobilise people for, and all these kind of things. So that, I think, is very, very important for us to be involved in campaigning and saying this is something which we have to oppose our government about. And I think it is a great shame that there aren't more MPs, that there aren't more media figures, and we have to get as many of those as possible involved. But we also have to mobilise the anti-war movement. And just to conclude on this sort of more general point, that these wars have now stained a generation of people in this country. A generation has grown up not knowing, these kids who are getting their A-level results this week, they have grown up with wars from the very beginning, and the costs of these wars has meant cuts in their health service, in their education service, in all these different kind of things. So it's a stain on them. It's an absolute disaster for the people of the countries most directly affected by these wars. It has created a growth of terrorism. It was originally called the War on Terror, but actually has created incrementally much greater levels of terrorism in countries like Libya, Syria, and elsewhere. It's created a much, much worse level of Islamophobia in this country. The racism towards Muslims is much, much higher than it was back in 2001. So in every respect, these are wars which are dangerous, not just to the individuals immediately affected by them, by the bombing and the killing, but also to all of us, for our politics, for our society, for our civil liberties, for all these different sorts of things. So, and the human misery cannot be overstated. Helen mentioned, and I'll just conclude on this, that the women are some of the greatest victims of war. During the First World War, something like 15% of the casualties of war were civilians. 85% were military. Now it's the other way around. The vast majority of casualties of war today are not the military of any country, and particularly not of the Western countries, which go to great lengths to protect their military, through drone warfare and through remote warfare of different sorts. It is the people on the ground, the civilians, who are suffering, and very much this is women, children, older people, these kind of people. They're suffering terrible environmental effects, displacement, mental and physical health issues. So let's remember that when we're talking about campaigning for Julian Assange and campaigning in support of what WikiLeaks did by telling some of the truth about these wars, that we are also standing up and fighting for the people who are actually suffering and still suffer as a result of what our government has done.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Lindsey. That was wonderful. Speaking about the suffering of people during these times of war, I think we can move on to the suffering, the personal suffering of Julian Assange, and the toll that this has had on him as a person. And we've got Alia with us now, who's a psychotherapist, who's going to discuss some of the implications of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that great introduction, Lindsey, and thanks for having me on Stop the War. I suppose I want to start by saying that I think it is quite extraordinary that such a complete perversion of justice has been carrying on for such a long time now without more public knowledge and outrage. And I think the lack of mainstream media coverage and the concerns over the rape allegations have kept people from engaging. But when you do read the details, the case is a fairly straightforward abuse of human rights and abuse of the judicial system, as Lindsey pointed out. All 18 counts that he's being charged with, or that are being put against him, are related solely to the 2010 publications of US government documents relating to wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and things that Lindsey's already mentioned. But the more you read about the case, the more similarities you can see between the way that Assange is being mistreated and the human rights violations that he brings to light through WikiLeaks. With Guantanamo Bay, for example, it's a place that represents illegal detention and unfair trials, if any trials. What the US found in Guantanamo Bay is an area where neither US nor international law applies. So they can continue to implement incredibly disturbing human rights abuses in the name of terrorism. The Cuban government regard the US presence there as illegal. Since 2001, 779 men have been taken there, and only one has ever been transferred to the US for trial in a civilian court. And obviously, most of these men are brown Muslim men. A lot of what's transpired in the case is illegal. The Ecuadorian government should have provided asylum on the grounds that he was under threat of political persecution, of torture in the US. The UK should have similarly protected him, but instead they illegally revoked his nationality and asylum. He was then arrested, etc. He's been denied his rights to a fair trial in the UK, and the uncomfortability around it. The rape allegations have made it difficult to talk about Julian Assange. It's difficult to acknowledge what's been going on because the affiliation is difficult to deal with. I think it's important to I implore people to look into the case. The charges have been dropped. The emails between the Crown Prosecution Service and the Swedish authorities, they seem very suspect. The lead lawyer, the lead CPS lawyer, he in emails he's written things like, "Don't you dare get cold feet." It's important to understand why it was dropped and why it wasn't dropped 4 years earlier when the Swedish authorities wanted to drop the case. We're never going to know the truth regarding those allegations. However, what we do know is that extradition on the basis of the indictment of the accusations, one of which was about hacking and 17 of which were related to, they were brought under the Espionage Act. The concerns were that he was a threat to US security, and this massively endangers the freedom of the press. His imprisonment, that's obviously very important. Prisons are they deliberately violate our human rights. That is their elementary function, both as a way of control and a way of punishment. They're an incredibly sadistic endeavor. I think it's important to talk about the way that they systematically prevent certain groups of society from excelling and even existing. He's being held in Belmarsh, as mentioned. It's a Category A prison, meaning it holds some very dangerous and very psychologically wounded people who have committed very violent crimes, while at the same time it holds political prisoners like Assange. you know, who he's not a threat to the public. He's in fact a threat to those in charge, who are ironically often there to perpetuate the ability to continue unfair and often corrupt systems governed by corrupt leaders. Belmarsh itself, it's interesting in that in 2001, between 2001 and 2002, it was referred to as the British version of Guantanamo Bay, and it was holding majority Pakistani Muslim men under Section 4 of the Anti-Terrorism Act, indefinitely without trial. It's been criticised by Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons for using extremely high amount of force to control inmates. Prisons in general, they have a huge impact on the mental health of detainees. Conditions such as overcrowding, various forms of violence, psychological, mental, physical, enforced solitude, and then conversely the lack of privacy, and lots of these sort of things like isolation from friends and networks and insecurity about the future, etc. These things have a huge impact on the mental health of people in prisons. Now, accumulatively, there is a huge, people in prison obviously commit suicide far more than, other groups of people in society. Now, solitary confinement, it's multiplying all of these things to an extent that it is torture. It has been categorized as torture in several international human rights treaties, and it's a violation of human rights law. Some of the symptoms, I suppose, that you might not really think about, there's the obvious ones such as stress, anxiety, depression, these kinds of mental health problems, but the lack of physical touch, the lack of sensory, any sensory real experience, these things have very, very different experience. Basically, the way that, the manifestation of these things can very easily take somebody to hallucinations, psychosis, things that, you wouldn't necessarily think about people experiencing. And then there are also physiological symptoms such as hypersensitivity, insomnia, paranoia, there's rage, there's fear, there's distortions of time and perception. There's lots and lots and lots of very disturbing effects that being put on your own for the majority of your day will have on you. Obviously, during COVID, prisons have become even less safe. The government, they're insisting that detention centres are being treated more like prisons to kind of encourage social distancing. Things are not being put in place to make it any easier for people in prison. In fact, it's making it much more difficult. They're not allowed to see anybody. They're not allowed to see anyone from the outside. And Assange himself suffers from a lung complaint. The barrister nonetheless forced him to continue being held in Belmarsh rather than being awarded bail. And this is while coronavirus will probably rip through the prison system. So, I'll end by saying we need to be clear who should be under scrutiny right now. And we have a government which by its behaviour around the COVID crisis has shown that they have a complete lack of concern for ordinary people's lives at home. And as Lindsay's mentioned, a complete, they're also waging wars in countries, mainly Muslim countries, where bombs are funded by our tax money and killed many innocent people. Julian Assange, on the other hand, represents the opposite, I think, of this particular ideology. Despite the initial nervousness about the case, essentially because of these accusations made against him that was severely pushed by the CPS, it can clearly be seen that he's very much on the side of the truth and the revelation of truth. And I think that it's important for people to understand what is actually going on. He represents the opposite of the status quo that upholds the rule of the fraudulent and the trustworthy. And I'll end there.
Thanks very much, Alia. That was wonderful. So we're going to move on to our next speaker now, who's Lucy Nichols. And Lucy's been doing some excellent work recently with the Stop the War student and youth group. So I'd like to bring Lucy in now. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me to Stop the War. I wanted to talk a little bit about the media campaign almost against Julian. as well as this weird co-option of feminism with regards to the rape cases. So Julian, he faces extradition to the US, where he's likely to be put in prison for 175 years, which is a life sentence, isn't it? He probably would die in prison there. And the US state, especially under Trump, is completely without morals. So if sent to the US, Julian, I believe, would probably face either physical or psychological torture. And it's not a stretch to say that his life would be at risk, given his current physical and mental health after almost a decade of being locked up in one place or another. He's currently in Belmarsh, which Alia said is just a completely awful place. There's no such thing as a humane prison, but Belmarsh is particularly horrible. Belmarsh in the middle of a pandemic is far, far worse. So it begs the question, how is it that the British judicial system, the British state, can justify this such cruel treatment of someone who's been so brave and has actually acted purely in the public interest by exposing the war crimes and the corruption? Well, in my opinion, they can't let him become a likeable character. He can't be viewed as a hero or a martyr or anything, because there would be public outcry if people started to view him as this. There'd be public outcry if the general public started to believe that the people who commit war crimes are worse than the people who expose them. So the media, the government, the US and British state have worked really hard over the last decade to completely destroy his reputation, which isn't a new thing. I think after a few years of Corbynism, it's quite obvious what the media will do to persuade you that people like Corbyn, like Assange, are dangerous when they're actually only working in the interests of the public and not the establishment. Often these media claims are completely contradictory and irrational. Somehow Corbyn is both a Birkenstock-wearing hippie and a terrorist sympathiser. Somehow Assange is both a crazy intelligent computer hacker and just a creepy bloke. But sadly, people seem to believe this weird doublespeak that has, done so much harm to Corbyn, but did so much more harm to Assange. So there was this weird campaign against him after the new right-wing Ecuadorian president, Lenin Moreno, ended his asylum and allowed him to be arrested in the Ecuadorian embassy in London and taken to Belmarsh. Julian was just viciously attacked and made out to be a terrible lodger, messy, smelly and an irresponsible pet owner. Moreno called him a spoiled brat and a miserable hacker whose only goal was to destabilise governments. They essentially tried to spin it as if this was an issue of Julian being a bad house guest and that Ecuador just couldn't look after him any longer, rather than this being the new president wanting to cozy up to the Americans and Donald Trump by pushing Julian one step closer to extradition. And of course, the elephant in the room is the much more sinister attempt to tarnish Julian's reputation. It's the attempt to character assassinate him completely that has come out of the two rape accusations against him, which have since been dropped by the Swedish authorities, and the statute of limitations on both of them has passed. So he can't be prosecuted for them and is to all intents and purposes innocent. But this served as a fantastic opportunity for the right wing, for the liberal media, to paint this as a feminist issue of Julian Assange versus these two women, rather than an imperialist power hiding behind war crimes, which in my eyes is just completely cynical and insulting to women and to Assange on just a number of levels. First of all, every woman will have experienced some sort of sexual assault, abuse or misconduct, which is commonplace, sadly, in every society, in the public sphere, in the private sphere. And this was highlighted by things like the Me Too movement, which garnered huge amounts of media attention and ultimately led to the downfall of two very powerful men. But other than this sort of brief liberal feminist transgression, we've seen that men in the public eye, men in the public eye especially, are often above the law and above scrutiny when it comes to sexual assaults. For example, Donald Trump is, the worst person ever, but he's also a complete misogynist and a rapist. Prince Andrew raped a child, was accused to have raped a child and then lied about it really badly on TV. And then there's also this anonymous Tory MP who's being investigated for rape, but the Conservatives still haven't removed the whip, which is surely like a huge safeguarding issue. So what I'm trying to say is that it's insulting.
Just to ask you to slow down. Somebody asked if we can all slow down a little bit. Somebody's a little hard of hearing. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, I'll slow down. Yeah, so what I'm saying is that it's insulting that the state, the media and the right can pick and choose when they're feminists, when they care about women, and when they aren't, when they don't care about women. So in turning Julian Assange into this vicious rapist, they're not demonstrating any concern for the women who have accused him of rape. They just want to destroy him, so that it's easier for us as people to accept the cruelty being forced on him in Belmarsh and, you know, in the Ecuadorian embassy, and the fact that he's being made an example of for going up against the war machine that is, you know, the US and Britain. It's also insulting that so often the left and anyone who defends Assange is labelled a misogynist or a rape apologist for suggesting that he shouldn't be extradited to the US for exposing war crimes, which is, you know, of course, a completely different issue to that of the rape accusations of which he is legally innocent and can't be prosecuted for. As Lindsey and Helen both mentioned earlier, we also have to remember the cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars on the women in these countries. The war in terror was famously heralded as a means of liberation for the women of the Middle East from their oppressive governments, societies and even religions. But this technique to bomb women into liberty, unsurprisingly, didn't work. And in many cases, women's lives have gotten much, much worse. So, you know, ISIS, for example, weren't great to women. So, you know, we can't let the government of the US or the West, you know, Britain and Europe and stuff, paint themselves as feminists for caring about the rape accusers for Julian, when, you know, all the evidence suggests that they're just not feminists. They don't care about women. They just care about keeping themselves in power and that. So sort of to conclude, you know, WikiLeaks did a lot to expose the true evils of Western imperialism and war. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan led to unspeakable cruelties against the people of the Middle East. State-sanctioned war crimes took place, and the people who are responsible have got away with it, while in a complete perversion of justice, it is the whistleblowers and journalists that have been punished for exposing these war crimes. You know, the various imperialist projects in the Middle East, I would argue since the Balfour Declaration, have been abject failures. The West, of course, you know, will try and argue against this. So when people like Julian Assange turn up and show the world the skeletons in these closets, the governments of these countries just aren't overly happy. And they'll do anything to try and discredit the people who are opening that closet and showing you the skeleton. So Julian Assange does not pose a threat to the general public or to women. He poses a huge threat to the warmongers and the lawmakers sitting in Washington and in Westminster. And, you know, this is why, despite everything that we're being told about him and everything the media is trying to do and the governments are trying to do to get us to ignore his, you know, horrible treatment, we have to support the campaign against extradition and we have to demonstrate our solidarity with him. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. That was a wonderful contribution. I noticed some comments in the chat. I'm sorry I'm not constantly following the chat because I'm also taking the questions as well and trying to group them together to prepare for the Q&A. So we do have somebody who's hard of hearing in the chat who's asked for the speakers to slow down a little bit. I'm probably not even doing that myself. But yeah, I think also we will be recording this and releasing it on YouTube. So I think there's automatic caption generation on YouTube. So hopefully you'll be able to go back and anything that you've missed, you'll be able to see in captions on there. So yeah, we're really honoured to have Suzie Gilbert with us today. Suzie is a filmmaker and producer, and thank you for joining us, Suzie.
Thank you, Stop the War. You all spoke so powerfully, and I think you've really covered most of what there is to say. And also this seems, I'm watching the questions in the chat, and it seems like a really sophisticated, knowledgeable audience because you're asking really smart, not obvious questions. So I think we should go to the Q&A pretty soon. I would only add, you know, a couple of things. You know, Julian's partner Stella made an interesting point that I think is worth remembering in that, and I've said this a couple of times before in other discussions, which is that the mainstream media discourse has fortunately evolved in the last few months. Despite all the sort of predictable character assassinations towards Julian, when he was dragged out of the embassy and the indictment was announced, most newspaper editorials, most press freedom and human rights groups have come out and said that this is, one of the most dangerous, cases of our generation when it comes to press freedom, and that this threatens all investigative journalists around the world. Because if the US can extradite an Australian citizen from the UK, what's to stop, Saudi, India, Israel doing that to any journalist anywhere. So I think it is heartening to see a little bit of a shift in the narrative between the mainstream media, human rights groups, sort of more centrist liberal types who might have before been more, just much more cynical. And there was a great webinar with Rebecca Vincent from Reporters Without Borders, who was saying, we should really welcome people to come to our side and evolve their position, and not be sort of stuck in the mud and be like, oh, you said this 3 years ago, you're banished. She said it far more eloquently than I. So I just want to highlight that has been a bit of a discourse shift, which is heartening. Also, just to point out, somebody was mentioning Biden in the chat. And I'll try and slow down. Sorry, I've just realized it's so easy to talk fast, so I'll try and slow down. Somebody in the chat was talking about Biden. Now, I think it's worth remembering, even though the Obama Department of Justice was not exactly a friend to whistleblowers and was very litigious, at the end of the day, the Obama Department of Justice did not prosecute WikiLeaks, whereas the Trump DOJ has done. And I think there is an appeal that we can make to the Biden administration, and we should look out, because I know there are some actions being done on this front. But I think we can make an appeal to Biden and Kamala Harris to say, if you come into office, you should drop these charges and abide by Obama's legacy, not by Trump's legacy. And I think there's a case we can make. Miracles can happen. We just saw in the last 24 hours, Trump is suddenly talking about maybe pardoning Snowden. Who knows how much truth there is to that? But, I'm trying to focus on where are we seeing some positive progress and where can we push on that? But I think you all covered it really, really powerfully and beautifully. And thank you, Stop the War. I worked for many years, for 10 years, with an anti-war filmmaker, Oliver Stone, who served in Vietnam and made many films about Vietnam and the march to war in Iraq. And that's how I got to know Julian. And I saw him a few days before his arrest, and it was really, really creepy and eerie, the condition he was in just a few days before the arrest. It was the first time I came out really creeped out by the situation. We couldn't speak because of the surveillance. We had to just write notes. And he looked terrible. He had a tooth problem and his face was all swollen. It was really eerie. And that was when he was in the embassy. So I can only imagine what it's like now. And also a huge thanks to everyone who's joining. I know there are so many webinars every day. So this is obviously a really smart, engaged crowd. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Suzie. It's really upsetting to hear about the pain that Julian's going through, as an individual. I wish there was a way that he knew, the support that he's got on the outside from all of these people that are desperate to help him. We do have a number of questions coming through. I'd like to remind the people watching, if you've got any questions, just to log them on the Q&A section rather than in the chat, because it's harder to follow that way. So Rona's asked, if the response to this could be a little slower and if you could speak up, what the charges against Julian Assange are and why Chelsea Manning was released but he was not. So does anybody want to take that question? So, Lindsey, I think you did mention what some of the, I think there's been an absence of actual charges, but do we know what the actual, the charges that the US are bringing?
Well, it's, as I understand it, it's under the Espionage Act of 1917, quite incredibly. This is obviously being used. It's a fairly obviously quite an archaic law, aimed at a time before there were computers and before there was any of the ways in which people leak things now. And as I was saying, of course, normally this would be, the person liable would be somebody who in 1917 would have handed over a secret document from an embassy or something and given it to somebody in a shady cafe or something. Now, obviously, the person who allegedly did that, which is Chelsea Manning, because she couldn't stand the horrific things that were going on that she was seeing all the time, has been charged. But as I said, the interesting sort of development of this is that it's not only the person who handed it over, but somebody who's published it thousands of miles away and in collaboration with a considerable number of highly respectable news outlets. So that's a kind of that's one of the things. Chelsea Manning, to be perfectly honest, I don't know the reason why. I know that a judge freed her, and I think it was to do with, perhaps someone could correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure that if none of the panelists know, that certainly people in the audience I know are very up with a lot of these things. But as I understand it, it was that she was being treated inhumanely and that should be released. Now, as I think all of us have made the point, if that's true of her, and I very much welcome that, because I think, again, she should be regarded as somebody who's done a great public service, not as a criminal of any sort. That surely should apply to Julian Assange, because these conditions are inhumane, whichever way you want to cut it. I mean, I think Alia made the point that prison in itself is inhumane, but this prison for extradition, this isn't about somebody who's murdered somebody or done anything like that. We can argue about how those people should be treated. This is somebody who one state wants to remove to their state, and there is absolutely no reason why he should be in prison at all.
And I'll just add to Lindsey's point on the Chelsea question. So Obama commuted Chelsea's sentence. I forget exactly how many years she'd served of her sentence. Maybe it was around 7 or something like that. She too had, I think, I forget if it was the UN Special Rapporteur, but somebody had said, that her treatment had counted pretty much as torture, solitary confinement, all sorts of things. But essentially, I think on the Chelsea case, there was a huge campaign that really got a lot of momentum. There was a very, very active campaign. And I think that pressure really made a difference. She'd been through a trial. She'd served some of her sentence, and ultimately it was commuted. There's a documentary film called XY Chelsea that you can watch about the process. But I think it shows that, let's hope Julian, something similar can happen with Julian. Nearly 7 years, somebody's saying.
We do have a question here from Paul McMichael, which links to that. And he says, if the mainstream media are so completely in cahoots against Julian, doesn't that make it absolutely incumbent on groups like Stop the War to use every opportunity to speak out, even if this means hijacking such media platforms, and also through arranging as many protests on the street as possible to get the truth out there and more? We can't allow this travesty to result in this innocent scapegoat being extradited. I mean, we completely agree with the points there, but the question there about the making it incumbent on groups like Stop the War to arrange, pressure meetings, demonstrations, things like that. I don't think there's anybody on the panel here who would disagree with that for a second. We've got a couple of questions also about Amnesty International. Let's have a look.
So they have put out a statement, and I'll pop it into the chat. So on the Don't Extradite Assange website, there's a button called Statements, and you can see what all the groups have posted. So Amnesty have in the end put out a statement. And just to your point you were making, Helen, about media, I think others on the panel maybe referenced this, but you probably know a site, Declassified, in the UK, an investigative journalism outlet. They've done great in-depth coverage of the case. They've covered some conflicts of interest in people involved in the case. And I think anything that we can do to amplify that coverage and for it to be picked up elsewhere would be really great. Yeah.
There was a second part to the question from Yuri. So he said that a number of left-wing NGOs like Amnesty have thrown Assange under the bus, and it goes on to say that given Keir Starmer of the Labour Party was part of the conspiracy to send Assange to Sweden, and Corbyn's two Foreign and Justice Secretaries Emily Thornberry and Shami Chakrabarti supported this unjust action, is it now time for the left or anti-imperialist movement to support parties like the Socialist Equality Party, which has stood by Assange from the start, unlike Corbyn and McDonnell and Labour at large? Who would like to answer that?
Well, I mean, I think firstly what's very important is that both the Assange campaign and Stop the War, we're not the prerogative of any one party, and we're not the same as party. You know, there's people from different parties belong to different campaigns, and that's as it should be. It should be that you don't have to be a member of the Labour Party or not a member of the Labour Party to be involved in Stop the War. I mean, my attitude to this, and I agree with much of what the question said. I think Amnesty has been kind of, I mean, you know, I slightly feel with some of these human rights organisations, they do kind of get there in the end, but kind of pretty reluctantly and pretty mealy-mouthed about this sort of thing. And I feel that about Amnesty on, you know, a number of issues actually, that they don't always speak out in the way or quickly enough or any of these sorts of things. And I certainly agree that I don't think Keir Starmer's going to do us any favours. I think it's slightly unfair on Jeremy Corbyn. I think actually, you know, he did take a reasonable position on it, and I think he still does support Assange. But I suppose my general point here is I don't really see the point of us all sitting here saying how terrible everybody is, even though it may well be true. And as I say, I agree with a number of the points the question has made. I think the question is, how can we put pressure on those people, including a lot of MPs who haven't particularly stepped forward, most of them, and how can we also build a much bigger campaign in order to get this more out there and to obviously do what we can to stop Julian being extradited. And I would just highlight one aspect of it. I think that although Labour hasn't been good on this, I think the trade union movement, we ought to do much, much more in the trade union movement. And Stop the War has, you know, we've got most of the big unions have supported us and do still support us over the years. And we found actually where we've tried to raise this question, I think it's true, people might have different experiences, but we've got a good response in trade union branches, and people have been happy to make a little donation about Julian or to say that they'll support a demonstration or maybe get their banner to a demonstration. I think these things are very important because, you know, the left is important in these kind of things. I know anybody can oppose a war, anybody can agree that Julian Assange needs to be freed, and people do, with all range of different political opinions, do that. But the left is very often the backbone of certainly building a mass campaign, and I think we definitely ought to put some effort into getting the support of trade unions in particular over the next period.
Yeah, I totally agree, Lindsey. And I think despite this being an issue that does sort of cut through political parties, parliamentary political parties, it is the left that applies pressure. It is the left that's used to organising and getting out on the streets. So those networks should be there already to get that going. Let's have a look. We've got a number of questions here that kind of ask, will Julian be? When will he be free? Is there any hope? You know, those sorts of questions. And I think, like many of us, the questions and the people asking the questions are looking for optimism here. How optimistic are you? And I'll ask that to all of the panelists. If you could all let me know what you think. It's obviously really difficult to predict the future, but yeah, our listeners are asking us to. If we can go to Lucy first.
Well, like you said, it's not easy to predict the future at all. But I think we do have a chance if there is a strong, progressive, unified and coherent movement in favour of Julian Assange. We've seen in the last few months alone exactly what protests can do. I mean, in a few days, there was the 17-year-old and 18-year-old students forced a government U-turn. We've seen tens of thousands of people take to the streets for Black Lives Matter. Union pressure has forced a number of government U-turns to keep us safe during coronavirus. So I think if there is any hope, it is in the movement, it's in the people. Perhaps some support we may have had in certain parties has gone away with certain new leaders who perhaps aren't as supportive as they used to be. But I think there is a serious chance that if we continue to do things like this and to continue to mobilise, then perhaps maybe one day, you know, Julian will be able to walk out of Belmarsh without risk of being extradited. Yeah.
I think it's important to know that the level of hope that we have goes up with the amount of work that we put into organising, and that the more we sit back, that hope drops. So hopefully, you know, this will inspire other people to go out there and organise their own sessions. We've got some questions about whether or not Julian is allowed visits and the conditions that he's in prison. Is he allowed to receive personal mail and things like that? So does anybody know whether or not we can send post to Julian?
So I believe you can send post, but I believe he hasn't had visits during this sort of COVID period. That's my understanding. So I think it's been quite a few months since Stella has been able to visit. They do speak by phone, so I know she's in regular contact with him. So I think mail, you know, I'm not sure like how much is getting through, but definitely I think mail is the way forward.
One of the questions was asking for the address to send. I think if you Google Belmarsh prison, you'll find the right address there pretty easily, and just address it to Julian. We've got a question here about the NUJ and their support for Julian Assange. Does anybody know a little bit more about that and how that's come about?
I just heard about that through the main campaign, the folks who are running the Don't Extradite Assange campaign. And I gather, I think there's a representative whose name I'm forgetting right now from the NUJ, the National Union for Journalists, who has attended some of the hearings. And I think Lindsey makes a great point about engaging more of the trade unions. I know that internationally, there are social movements and unions which are getting engaged and are starting some events. I was just on the phone with folks in Brazil who are organizing an event in early September with unions and movements around the world from the global south. But I think, as Lindsey says, I think mass mobilization of unions would be amazing. And I think that's what happened in the US around Chelsea as well. For the latest on the NUJ, I would go to the don'textraditeassange.com website, because that will have the NUJ statement. And if you're interested in finding out more, by all means, get in touch with me and I can dig in and find out more. You can ping me on Twitter, or you can ping the folks at Don't Extradite Assange, and we can get a more up-to-date status on what NUJ is doing. But my understanding is they have someone who's sort of the main point person who's engaging the union.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, what Susie's just said. And I think obviously we should encourage anybody who is a journalist or member of the union or any other unions to you know, do what they can to mobilise. I mean, there's this kind of story that goes around that Julian isn't a journalist. He's not really a journalist, coming from people who frankly really aren't journalists or shouldn't be journalists, some of them, you know, because he sort of downloads material as opposed to write idiotic, opinionated articles in the Times or whatever qualifies you for a journalist these days. But, you know, the NUJ is supporting him. They have put the statement out, and that's very important, you know.
Carol has asked whether or not Julian gets to FaceTime with his children. You might know, Suzie. They grow up so quickly. Is he getting to see them? It's so sad that he's missing out on their childhood.
I doubt it right now. We can find out, but I doubt it, because I suspect he's just calling from a payphone. So I doubt it at the moment. Yeah. I think he's just got, if I understand correctly, I think it's just short, like 10-minute calls that he can make to Stella. So I don't think, sadly, he is doing any FaceTiming, no.
I was obviously doing a little bit of research before today, and I came across an interview that happened with Julian's dad, and one of the comments that he made was about he was convinced that the trial would be delayed until after the presidential election. Does anybody else think that that's a likelihood?
I've heard those rumors, but I don't think anyone really knows. I've heard some people say, oh, maybe the Trump administration would rather it happen after the election because, you know, you don't want sort of unpredictable things that might come out of the case. But I don't think anyone really knows. So I think the defense want to just get on with it. You know, Julian's not in a great health condition, and I think this has been so delayed already. They just want to get on with this and not delay any further. But I've definitely heard those rumors as well. Absolutely.
So I think one of the things that we fight for is you know, that the case is expedited quickly as well for Julian's sake. I'm just going through the questions. There's quite a lot here. So we've got one here from an anonymous attendee that said, beyond the left, although certainly within it, what other arguments do you suggest to mobilise more women into looking into and supporting not only Assange, but the anti-war movement? Can we, Alia, do you have any ideas on this, on, you know, arguments around mobilising more women?
Well, I guess, you know, the point's been made, I think, by Lucy, that, you know, rape is a weapon of war, and it has been for a very long time, you know, and the allegations of rape, I feel, were, you know, if you look into it, it looks as though they have been used in a kind of converse way to prevent him from being seen as somebody who has really helped people understand what's going on in the Middle East and in different countries where the UK are backing the US, you know, to commit horrible war crimes, and that affects people in this country as well. You know, terrorism is very much connected to the disruption that we see, or that we don't see, but that we know now, thanks to WikiLeaks, that actually occur in different parts of the world, and that obviously affects women and children in different ways to men, you know, in very different ways to men. And that's really, really, I think it's quite a key point. And I think, you know, understanding what's actually going on is incredibly important. And Assange has made that possible for people. How to engage women, I think, you know, I've mentioned it so much, I don't want to labour the point, but I think it has really prevented people from getting involved with the case. I think it's important to read about it and really understand what happened. And that does help people feel a bit more freed up to support something that's very obviously needs to be supported. It's a very obvious case. I suppose, you know, thinking about what's the abuse that he's being subjected to. You know, Helen mentioned his father. He last visited Julian Assange in August. From what I was reading, he was a bit shaky, suffering from anxiety, and it's very clear that the intensity of his treatment, according to his father, has been increased over the past year. You know, Niels Melzer from the UN he's a specialist on torture, and the way that he talks about the way that Julian Assange has been treated, you know, they've never seen something so intense, or seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize and abuse a single individual for such a long time, and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of the law. So yeah, I don't really know exactly how to get women involved, but I think really learning about what's happening and what has happened has helped me get a little bit more involved. And I think that's really one of the main ways we're going to really confront.
I think because this cuts through so many political arenas, there's groups that we could that we could approach people like, I mean, locally we've got something called the Seroptimists. You know, this could be things that the WI might be interested in hearing about, or, you know, anywhere where you can find groups of women meeting, you can ask to go and speak to them, or you can go along and just talk to people. I do, you know, 100% think that going and speaking to people face to face and explaining things, that's usually how you get your message across. But obviously we are massively hindered by that restriction at the moment, and the ability not to go and do that. There's just a comment here in the chat. It's the most recent one, so that's why I've noticed it here. There's a group called Women Against Rape that did a fantastic article in The Guardian, and I would suggest that everybody here reads that article. We can share the link in the comments and in the event, because it really is a fantastic piece of writing, and it's the rationale behind the meeting today. So yeah, we'll just nip to Lindsey for a summation if possible, although I think we have covered the majority of points, and once we've spoken to Lindsey, I'll just recap with a few things that you can do going forward as well.
Okay, thanks Helen, and it's been a real pleasure to be with all the panelists and everything. Just a couple of very brief points. I noticed that Trump today has announced that he's pardoning Susan B. Anthony, who was a 19th century feminist campaigner for the suffrage, because she committed some crime then. So I don't think we can kind of rely too much on waiting for, you know, for him or indeed his successor, if it's Biden, to do this. So I think, you know, our campaigning relies on what we do and how we can begin to create an atmosphere where it's not tenable for them to extradite him. It's not tenable in the United States, and it's not tenable in Britain. And I think that's a very, very important development. And I think that, you know, doing that, we need to use all these arguments. And people have talked a lot about the different aspects of it, the rape charges and the different aspects. I mean, I think one of the important things is just to explain what the facts are, not just over that case where obviously the charges have been dropped, but if you look at the various aspects of it, did it damage anybody? What was the whole point of the leaks? All this sort of thing. I don't think it hurts, because quite a lot of people, even if they knew that a few years ago, have forgotten or haven't kept up with it. So I think that's important. And in terms of mobilising, just to come back to that final question about women are much more anti-war than men. If you look at opinion polls and things like that, actually, you find actually women are much more progressive than men on a number of things. There's more women in unions in this country than men. They're much better on these questions of war and peace. Now, I'm sure none of the panel will be surprised by that revelation, but nonetheless, it means we have got this kind of audience that, I'm not saying it should be exclusively women at all. Obviously, there's lots and lots of men who do support the campaign and can support the campaign. But I think it is very important that we see women as people who are going to be actively involved in this campaign, in the anti-war movement, in Stop the War. So that's really where I'll end. I think it's vitally important we do what we can. There is this court case coming up in a few weeks that the focus will be on that. There will be media, there will be some, let's not get too hopeful about the coverage, but there will be some coverage of it, some national coverage, and that gives us an opportunity to discuss it with workmates, with people at school or at college, with family and friends, and to begin to build this into a much bigger movement. So that's what I'd urge people to do. I'd urge people to look at the Don't Extradite Assange website and those things, and also to support Stop the War, because we have been campaigning around these wars for very, very long time indeed now, and we do have to continue to do so. So thanks ever so much for Helen for putting this on. It's really good, and thanks for inviting me, and I'm sure everybody else feels the same. And thanks to everybody who's come and taken part in it.
Thank you, Lindsey. And I want to put a massive thanks to Geraldine, who is my co-organiser with Cheshire Stop the War. This is a passion project for Geraldine, and it's a meeting that she's been wanting to organise for a long time. Obviously, everything that happened put another meeting ahead of this one, but here we are, and it's happened. So I'd just like to ask the people who've attended today to share this meeting. There's a live stream on Facebook, so if you can go and share that to your friends, prepare yourself with the arguments, because you will be faced with them from even your most progressive friends. They'll start presenting you with arguments that are really difficult to get around. So message me, message your friends, and prepare yourself with the correct responses, and keep speaking to people. Keep hosting events like this throughout September. Educate the public on the value of the leaks that Assange exposed. Keep talking about the things that he exposed. Keep talking about the crimes that happened, the real life examples of war crimes and pain, and the things that the countries and the leaders that we've elected in our name did in our name. Change and cut the political nature of the deportation to make it a more human and a more moral case, and strengthen our solidarity and campaigns. So public voices need to be louder, so that the newspapers who benefited most from WikiLeaks won't be able to ignore the injustice and write columns in Julian's defence. The tide is turning in the newspapers. And the more public outcry there is, and the more empathy with Assange there is, the harder it'll be for that judge to do the wrong thing. Write to your MP if you haven't done so. There is a letter on the DEA website. Support DEA, that's Don't Extradite Assange. If you search that, you'll see the page. There's loads of different videos and resources there that you can watch. And the other thing that I just thought of a minute ago is also write a letter to your local newspaper. They're so desperate for content for your local newspapers, because they fill them full of adverts for double glazing companies. Send a letter in to your local newspaper, be it the Chronicle or whatever. You'll probably get a nasty one back the week after, and it turns into a saga that lasts for months, and people get excited reading them. Or maybe that's just in Cheshire, I'm not sure. But yeah, so keep going, keep pushing, and thanks very much for attending today.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.